April 4th, 1945. Lorraine, France. A light rain fell on the small village of Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont, washing away the last remnants of a bitter winter as Lieutenant Thomas Hargrove stood at the edge of the settlement, studying the collection of stone houses through his field binoculars. He believed this would be a routine operation, another abandoned village to secure as the Allied forces pushed eastward toward Germany in the final months of the conflict. The orders from Division Command seemed straightforward: clear and burn any structures that could provide shelter to enemy stragglers. Hargrove had no idea that what awaited him in the third house on the right would challenge everything. He thought he understood about duty, humanity, and the true cost of following orders. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how one American soldier's encounter with a simple French farmhouse transformed not only his understanding of the conflict, but ultimately saved dozens of lives and created an unexpected bridge between two nations that would last for generations. The rain intensified as Hargrove signaled for his men to advance. First Sergeant James Calloway, a former steelworker from Pennsylvania, brought the platoon to attention. 34 soldiers of the 103rd Infantry Division moved cautiously through the morning mist, weapons ready, eyes scanning windows and doorways for any sign of the enemy. "Remember, we've had reports of German holdouts using these villages as observation posts," Hargrove told his men. "Check every building thoroughly before we implement the clearing protocol." Calloway nodded grimly. At 38 years old, he was significantly older than most of the men in the unit and had seen enough of the conflict to know that clearing protocol was headquarters' sanitized language for destruction. He had participated in 17 similar operations since landing at Normandy the previous summer. "Patterson and Ramirez, take point," Calloway ordered. "Rodriguez and Wilson, cover the flanks. The rest of you, standard search formation." Private First Class Michael Patterson, 22, from Portland, Oregon, advanced cautiously with his rifle at the ready. He had been with the unit for only 4 months, but had already earned respect for his steady hand and sharp eyes. Beside him, Private Luis Ramirez, barely 19, and from a small farming community outside of San Antonio, Texas, moved with the nervous energy of youth. "Streets look empty, Sarge," Patterson called back. "No signs of recent activity." The intelligence briefing had indicated that the village had been evacuated 3 weeks earlier, when German forces retreated across the nearby River Marne, but everyone knew that intelligence was frequently wrong. Just 2 weeks prior, a similar abandoned village had contained a German sniper team that took out 3 Americans before being neutralized. Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont consisted of approximately 60 structures arranged along a main street, with several smaller lanes branching off like tributaries. Most were simple 2-story stone buildings with slate roofs, typical of the Lorraine region. Sturdy dwellings built to withstand harsh winters and house generations of the same family. A modest church steeple rose from the center of the village, its bell tower silent for the first time in centuries. As the platoon moved deeper into the village, the signs of hasty evacuation became evident. Doors left ajar, curtains fluttering through broken windows, a child's doll abandoned in the middle of the street, mute testimony to lives interrupted. A farmer's cart lay overturned near the village square, its contents long since scavenged. "Check each house systematically," Lieutenant Hargrove ordered. "Teams of 3, standard clearing procedure." Hargrove had been a history teacher from Connecticut before the war. At 31, he had volunteered in 1942, leaving behind a pregnant wife and a classroom of high school students. The irony of now destroying historical European villages that he might once have lectured about was not lost on him. The first 2 houses proved to be empty, as expected. Patterson, Ramirez, and Corporal Frank Nowak, a former Chicago police officer, approached the 3rd house on the right side of the main street. It was distinguished from its neighbors by a small garden that, despite neglect, still showed signs of careful planning. Lavender, rosemary, and thyme grew in organized rows. "This one looks different," Nowak observed. "Someone took care of this place." Patterson nodded. "Doors closed, not open like the others." The 3 men exchanged glances. Closed doors often meant occupants or worse, booby traps. "Standard procedure," Nowak reminded them. "I'll take point." The corporal approached the wooden door, testing it gently with his gloved hand. Finding it unlocked, he pushed it open slowly, while Patterson and Ramirez covered him from both sides. No shots rang out. No explosion followed. Instead, a wave of warm air greeted them, carrying the unmistakable aroma of fresh bread. "We've got occupants," Nowak whispered, signaling the others to maintain caution. The interior of the house was modest but meticulously maintained. A small fire burned in the hearth, and a pot of something, soup by the smell of it, simmered above the flames. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a wooden table at its center surrounded by 4 chairs. A half-finished meal sat on one plate. Someone had left in a hurry. "Hello," Patterson called out in halting French. "Anyone here? Americans." Silence answered him. Then, almost imperceptibly, the sound of breathing came from behind a large wooden armoire in the corner. "Come out with your hands visible," Nowak ordered, his rifle trained on the furniture piece. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a figure emerged. Not a German soldier or a French resistance fighter, but an elderly woman, perhaps 70 years old, her silver hair tied back in a neat bun, wearing a simple blue dress covered by an apron. Her hands trembled, but her eyes showed more defiance than fear. "Madame," Patterson began, lowering his weapon slightly, "vous devez quitter. C'est dangereux ici." His limited French suggested she needed to leave, that it was dangerous. The woman straightened her posture and responded in heavily accented but understandable English. "This is my home. I will not leave." The 3 soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. Their orders were clear. Clear the village, then burn it to prevent enemy use. But those orders presumed empty buildings. "Madame, the entire village was supposed to be evacuated," Nowak explained. "There's still fighting in this area." "My name is Marie Bouvier," she replied with dignity. "I have lived in this house for 47 years. I buried my husband in the garden behind this house 4 years ago. I will join him there, not as a refugee in some camp." Ramirez shifted uncomfortably. "We should get the lieutenant." As Patterson turned to fetch Hargrove, he noticed something on the mantelpiece that made him pause. A framed photograph of a young man in an American military uniform from the previous conflict. The resemblance to the woman was unmistakable. The same determined set of the jaw, the same penetrating eyes. Lieutenant Hargrove arrived moments later, ducking through the low doorway. The rain had plastered his hair to his forehead, making him look younger than his 31 years. "Madame Bouvier," he began after introductions, "I understand your attachment to your home, but we have orders." "Your orders are to protect innocent people, are they not, Lieutenant?" Marie interrupted. "I am no threat to you or your men." Hargrove struggled visibly with his response. "It's not about threats, madame. It's about denying the enemy any potential resources or observation posts." Marie gestured to the photograph that had caught Patterson's attention. "That is my son, Jean-Pierre. He died fighting alongside Americans in 1918. He believed in what you represented: freedom, justice, the right of people to live in peace in their own homes." The revelation hung in the air. Hargrove studied the photograph more carefully, noting the insignia of the American Expeditionary Forces from the First World War. "Your son served with the Americans?" "He was an interpreter. He attended university in Paris, studied English. When your country joined the fight, he volunteered immediately." Her voice softened with pride and sorrow. "He is buried in the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery. An American colonel told me he died saving 3 of your soldiers." The small house suddenly felt charged with history and connection. Outside, the rest of the platoon continued their sweep of the village, unaware of the drama unfolding in this unassuming dwelling. "Madame," Hargrove began again, his tone gentler, "I understand, but do you?" she challenged. "Do you understand what it means to lose everything twice in one lifetime? To rebuild after one great conflict, only to face destruction again? Look around you, Lieutenant. What strategic value does my little home have?" Before Hargrove could respond, Sergeant Calloway appeared at the doorway. "Sir, we've completed the initial sweep. Village appears clear. But—" he paused, taking in the scene before him. "We have a situation." "What kind of situation, Sergeant?" Hargrove asked, grateful for the interruption. "We've found more civilians, sir. 13 in total, hiding in the root cellar of the building adjacent to the church, mostly elderly, 2 children, 1 infant. Marie Bouvier showed no surprise at this news. If anything, a flash of vindication crossed her features. "You knew about them," Hargrove realized, turning back to the woman. "Of course I knew," she replied simply. "They are my neighbors, my friends. They could not make the journey to the evacuation centers. The children's mother died 3 weeks ago, pneumonia. Their father is fighting somewhere on your side. The others are too old or too ill to travel." Hargrove removed his helmet and ran a hand through his damp hair, a gesture of frustration and uncertainty that his men rarely witnessed. The mission parameters were clear, but the reality on the ground had just become considerably more complicated. "We need to report this to company command," and he said finally. "Sergeant, set up a defensive perimeter and keep the sweep ongoing. I want to know if there are any more surprises in this village." "Yes, sir," Calloway replied, departing to relay the orders. Left alone with Marie Bouvier, Hargrove found himself drawn to the photographs and mementos that lined the walls of her modest home. Besides the image of her son in an American uniform, there were older sepia-toned family portraits, a wedding photograph showing a much younger Marie beside a tall, serious-looking man, and various snapshots documenting a lifetime in this small village. "Your husband?" Hargrove asked, gesturing to the wedding photograph. "Henri," Marie confirmed. "He was the village doctor for 41 years. During the last war, he treated soldiers from both sides. He believed that suffering knows no nationality." The lieutenant found himself nodding. "My father was a field surgeon at Belleau Wood. He told me similar things." For the first time, a hint of warmth entered Marie's expression. "Your father is a wise man." "Was," Hargrove corrected gently. "He passed in 39. Pneumonia. Like your neighbor." Marie made a small sound of sympathy and, despite the tension of their situation, gestured to the pot simmering over the fire. "You should eat something, Lieutenant. Your men as well. I made enough for several people." The unexpected offer caught Hargrove off guard. Here was a woman whose home he was under orders to destroy, offering him a meal. "I couldn't possibly—" "Nonsense," Marie interrupted. "Henri always said decisions should never be made on an empty stomach, and from the look of you and your men, you haven't had a proper meal in weeks." There was truth to her observation. The rapid advance of Allied forces had stretched supply lines, and hot meals had become increasingly rare as they pushed eastward. "Thank you, but I need to contact my superior officer first," Hargrove replied, stepping outside to use the field radio that Specialist Morris had set up in the village square. The conversation with Captain Reynolds at company headquarters was brief and frustrating. "Orders are orders, Lieutenant," Reynolds's voice crackled through the static. "The entire sector needs to be cleared. Division Intelligence believes the enemy is using these villages as staging areas for counterattacks. Sir, we have 14 civilians here, including children. Evacuation will be challenging. Then evacuate them, Hargrove. Get them on trucks and move them west. But that village cannot remain intact, is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Hargrove replied mechanically, even as his mind raced through alternatives. "I need this done today, Lieutenant. We have reports of enemy movement 10 kilometers east of your position. We can't risk them having forward observation posts." The radio connection terminated, leaving Hargrove standing in the rain, the weight of his orders pressing down more heavily than his soaked uniform. He made his way back to Marie Bouvier's house, where he found Patterson and Ramirez seated at her table, each with a bowl of vegetable soup before them. They stood quickly when he entered, looking vaguely guilty. "She insisted, sir," Patterson explained. "Sit down, eat," Hargrove said, waving them back to their meal. He turned to Marie, who was slicing a loaf of dark bread. "Madame, I need to speak with you privately." They stepped into a small adjoining room, a bedroom with a single narrow bed, neatly made, and a small writing desk beneath the window. A well-worn Bible sat open beside a journal and inkwell. "Company command has confirmed our orders," Hargrove began, finding it difficult to meet the elderly woman's steady gaze. "The village must be cleared. We can provide transportation for you and the others to an evacuation center near Châlons-en-Champagne. You'll be safe there until—" "Until when, Lieutenant?" Marie interrupted. "Until there is nothing left to return to? Until I am dead and forgotten in some refugee camp? No, I have told you my decision. Hargrove struggled to maintain his professional demeanor. This isn't a negotiation, Madame Bouvier. These orders come from Division Command. The entire area needs to be destroyed, she finished for him. Yes, I understand military necessity. I lived through the last great conflict. I watched villages like this one reduced to rubble. And for what? 20 years later, here we are again, young men following orders to destroy what old men failed to protect. Her words struck uncomfortably close to thoughts Hargrove himself had harbored during the long campaign across France. He had joined to fight fascism, to protect democracy and freedom, yet so often found himself implementing destruction rather than preservation. I don't have a choice, he said finally. We always have choices, Lieutenant Hargrove, Marie replied. Sometimes they are merely difficult ones. A knock at the door frame interrupted them. Sergeant Calloway stood there, his expression grim. Sir, we've got a situation with the civilians by the church. One of the elderly men is having some kind of attack, can't breathe properly. Rodriguez thinks it might be his heart. Marie immediately pushed past them, moving with surprising agility for her age. Take me to him, she commanded. My husband was the doctor here. I assisted him for 40 years. Hargrove followed as Marie grabbed a small leather bag from a cabinet, a physician's kit, he realized, and hurried toward the church. The rain had stopped, leaving the village street slick and reflective in the midday light. The root cellar where the villagers had been hiding was accessed through a heavy wooden door set into the ground, beside what appeared to be the former priest's residence. Two of Hargrove's men stood guard, while Rodriguez, who had served as a medical assistant before the war, knelt beside an elderly man who lay gasping on a makeshift pallet. Monsieur Dupont, Marie said, immediately kneeling despite her age. Breathe slowly. Georges, look at me. She opened the medical bag and efficiently prepared what Hargrove recognized as a tincture of some kind. With practiced movements, she mixed it with water from a canteen offered by one of the soldiers and helped the man drink it. Within minutes, his breathing began to ease. Digitalis, she explained to Rodriguez. Henri grew foxglove in our garden specifically for Monsieur Dupont's heart condition. He's had these attacks for years. Rodriguez nodded, impressed. I was about to try atropine, but that's much better for his condition. While Marie tended to the elderly man, Hargrove surveyed the other villagers. Just as she had described, they were primarily elderly, with the exception of two young children, a boy of perhaps 6 and a girl of 4, who clung to an older woman Hargrove assumed was their grandmother. The infant Marie had mentioned was cradled in the arms of a frail-looking woman who couldn't have been younger than 70. These people can't travel far, Calloway observed quietly, coming to stand beside Hargrove. Especially not in the backs of our trucks over these roads. I know, Hargrove acknowledged, but orders are orders. Calloway, normally the epitome of military discipline, hesitated. Sir, if I may speak freely, go ahead, Sergeant. These people remind me of my own parents. My father has a heart condition not unlike this gentleman's. The thought of forcing him to evacuate his home, especially to burn it afterward. He left the thought unfinished. Hargrove understood. Many of his men had been fighting for nearly a year now, pushing across France and into Germany. They had liberated villages and towns, been welcomed as heroes by grateful French civilians. The order to now destroy homes in a country they had come to save created a cognitive dissonance that was becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile. The captain was clear, Hargrove said, as much to convince himself as Calloway. This entire area needs to be cleared to prevent enemy observation and counterattacks. With all due respect, sir, we've seen no signs of enemy activity in this sector for over 2 weeks. Intelligence said this village was empty, and they were wrong about that. Maybe they're wrong about the strategic necessity too. Before Hargrove could respond, a commotion erupted from the village's eastern entrance. Private Wilson came running toward them, his rifle at the ready. Lieutenant, we've got movement on the eastern approach. Multiple vehicles. Hargrove's training took over. Combat positions, everyone. Civilians stay down here in the cellar. Sergeant, get 4 men on the eastern edge, elevated positions. Patterson, Ramirez with me. The platoon moved with practiced efficiency, taking defensive positions throughout the village. Hargrove, Patterson, and Ramirez made their way to the church tower, which offered the best vantage point over the approaching road. Through his binoculars, Hargrove observed a convoy of 3 vehicles approaching the village, not the feared German patrol, but American jeeps bearing the insignia of the 75th Infantry Division. "Stand down," he called out. "They're ours." The lead jeep pulled into the village square, and a major stepped out, scanning the buildings with an air of authority. Hargrove made his way down from the church tower and approached with a salute. "Lieutenant Thomas Hargrove, 103rd Infantry, sir." "Major Robert Collins, 75th Division Intelligence." The officer returned the salute. "We're surveying forward positions. This area is supposed to be cleared by now, Lieutenant." "We've encountered complications, sir. 14 civilians still in the village, several elderly and infirm, plus young children. We were making arrangements for evacuation." Major Collins frowned. "Evacuation should have been handled by Civil Affairs 3 weeks ago." "Yes, sir. But these individuals were either missed or chose to remain behind. One is the mother of an American interpreter who served in the First World War." The mention of this connection seemed to give Collins pause. "Show me," he ordered. Hargrove led the major to Marie Bouvier's house, where she had returned after stabilizing Monsieur Dupont. She stood in her doorway, somehow managing to look dignified despite the uncertainty of her situation. "Madame Bouvier," Hargrove began, "this is Major Collins from Divisional Intelligence." Marie nodded respectfully but said nothing, waiting for the major to speak first. "Madame, Lieutenant Hargrove tells me your son served with American forces in the previous conflict." "Jean-Pierre," she confirmed, retrieving the photograph from her mantelpiece and offering it to Collins. "He was an interpreter with the 42nd Division. He died at Chateau Thierry." Collins studied the photograph with unexpected intensity. "The Rainbow Division," he said softly. "You know it?" Marie asked. "My father served with them," Collins replied. His professional demeanor momentarily softened. "He was wounded at Chateau Thierry. Always spoke of the brave French interpreter who helped coordinate the counterattack." He looked up from the photograph to Marie's face. "What was your son's full name?" "Jean-Pierre Bouvier," she replied, a tremor of emotion in her voice. Collins stared at her for a long moment, then handed the photograph back with noticeable care. "Madame Bouvier, my father was Captain James Collins. He wrote about a Jean Bouvier in his journals, described him as the bravest man he'd ever met. Said this interpreter saved his life and the lives of 2 other officers by warning them of an enemy flanking maneuver at the cost of his own." Marie's composure finally broke. Tears welled in her eyes as she reached out to steady herself against the doorframe. "Your father survived?" "He did," Collins confirmed. "Lived until 1940, long enough to see me graduate from West Point. He would visit the Rainbow Division Memorial every year on the anniversary of Chateau Thierry and leave flowers for the men who didn't come home, your son among them." The coincidence, if it was indeed coincidence, left Hargrove momentarily speechless. The odds of this particular major from this particular division arriving at this precise moment seemed astronomical. Marie invited them inside, where she retrieved a metal box from beneath a floorboard under her bed. From it, she produced a letter in English, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. "From Captain James Collins to the family of interpreter Jean Bouvier," she read aloud, her accent thickening with emotion. "It is with profound grief but also immeasurable gratitude that I write to inform you of your son's heroic actions." Major Collins listened, visibly moved as Marie read his father's words, describing Jean-Pierre's sacrifice. When she finished, silence filled the small room, broken only by the distant sounds of soldiers securing the perimeter of the village. Finally, Collins spoke. "Lieutenant Hargrove, I'm countermanding your previous orders regarding this village." "Sir?" Hargrove couldn't hide his surprise. "Intelligence reassessment," Collins stated firmly. "This location has minimal strategic value to enemy operations. Furthermore, the presence of civilians creates a humanitarian consideration that outweighs any marginal tactical advantage gained by clearing." Relief washed over Hargrove. "What should we do instead, sir?" "Establish a temporary security perimeter. I'll arrange for medical personnel to evaluate the civilians and determine appropriate accommodations. The village remains under Allied protection. Collins turned to Marie. No one will burn your home, Madame Bouvier. You have my word, and I suspect my father would demand nothing less. Marie reached out and grasped the Major's hand. Thank you, she said simply. As Collins departed to make arrangements via his radio operator, Hargrove found himself alone again with Marie Bouvier. The weight that had pressed upon him since receiving his orders had lifted, replaced by a sense of rightness that transcended military protocol. It seems your son is still protecting this village, Madame Bouvier, Hargrove observed. Marie smiled, touching the frame of Jean-Pierre's photograph. Henri always said that good deeds create ripples across time. I never fully understood until today. Outside, the afternoon sun had broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across the village. Sergeant Calloway was already reorganizing the men, transitioning from a clearing operation to a security detail. The children who had been hiding in the root cellar were now cautiously exploring the village square under the watchful eyes of their grandmother and several soldiers who had produced chocolate rations from their packs. "Lieutenant," Marie said, interrupting Hargrove's observations, "would you and your men join me for dinner tonight? I have been saving provisions for a special occasion. I believe this qualifies." Hargrove found himself smiling for what felt like the first time in months. "We would be honored, Madame." That evening, Marie's small home was filled to capacity as she fed Hargrove's platoon in shifts. The simple meal of vegetable soup, preserved meat and fresh bread felt like a feast to men who had been subsisting on field rations for weeks. More than the food, however, it was the atmosphere of momentary normalcy, of civilization reclaimed from the chaos of conflict, that nourished them. As the first group of soldiers finished their meal and made way for the next shift, Private Patterson lingered, helping Marie clear the dishes. "My grandmother has a kitchen just like this," he told her. "In Oregon, she makes sourdough bread every Sunday. When you return to her," Marie replied, "tell her that a French grandmother sends her respects and thanks her for raising a grandson who remembers his humanity even in war." Patterson nodded, unexpectedly emotional. "I will, ma'am. Thank you." Later that night, after the men had returned to their defensive positions around the village, Hargrove sat with Marie by her hearth. The fire had burned low, casting the room in a gentle amber glow. Outside, a full moon illuminated the village, transforming the war-worn landscape into something almost peaceful. "You know," Marie said thoughtfully, "when I first saw American soldiers entering the village today, I thought history was simply repeating itself. Another generation of young men fighting across the same fields, burning the same villages." She paused, stoking the embers with an iron poker. "But perhaps that's not entirely accurate. Perhaps what repeats is not just the conflict, but also the opportunities for compassion within it." Hargrove considered her words. Throughout his months of combat, he had carried out countless orders, some of which had troubled his conscience. But never before had he been so close to an action that felt fundamentally wrong. And never before had the intervention of chance, history, and human connection aligned so perfectly to prevent it. "I enlisted because I believed we were fighting for something better," he admitted. "Sometimes, amid all the destruction, it's hard to remember what that was." "And now?" Marie asked. "Now I remember," he replied simply. As he prepared to leave for his night patrol, Marie pressed something into his hand, a small worn book with a leather cover. "This was Jean-Pierre's journal from his time with the American forces," she explained. "I think he would want you to have it. Perhaps when this conflict is finally over, you might return and we could talk about it." Hargrove accepted the journal with reverence. "I would like that very much, Madame Bouvier." Stepping out into the moonlight, Hargrove tucked the journal into his breast pocket, feeling its weight against his heart. The village of Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont slumbered around him, preserved from destruction by an extraordinary intersection of past and present. He found Sergeant Calloway at the western checkpoint, gazing at the stars visible between scattered clouds. "Beautiful night, sir," Calloway observed. "Yes, it is," Hargrove agreed. "Have the men rotate watches every 2 hours. I want everyone to get some rest." "Already arranged, sir." Calloway hesitated, then added, "The men are talking about what happened today, how we almost burned this place before Major Collins arrived. They're saying it would have been wrong. They're right, Hargrove said with conviction. Sometimes the most important orders are the ones we question. As he continued his circuit of the village perimeter, the lieutenant's thoughts drifted to the journal in his pocket and the connections that had saved this small community. He wondered how many other villages had not been so fortunate, how many other Marie Bouvier had watched their homes reduced to ash in the name of strategic necessity. In the distance, the occasional rumble of artillery reminded him that the conflict continued beyond this temporary island of reprieve. But for tonight, at least, in this small French village, something had been preserved that transcended military objectives, a continuity of human decency amid the fracturing forces of war. The eastern horizon was just beginning to lighten when a messenger arrived from division headquarters with new orders. Major Collins had been true to his word. Not only would Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont be spared, but Hargrove's platoon was being reassigned as a temporary protective force for the village and its inhabitants, until proper civil affairs personnel could arrive to assist the civilians. As dawn broke over the village, Hargrove found Marie Bouvier already awake, tending her garden in the soft morning light. She looked up as he approached, a question in her eyes. "Good news," he told her. "We're staying for a while. Orders from headquarters." Her weathered face broke into a smile that seemed to erase decades of hardship. "Then I shall have to plant more vegetables." Soldiers have healthy appetites. Together they stood in the awakening village, the elderly Frenchwoman who had refused to abandon her home and the American lieutenant who had been ordered to destroy it, united by an unexpected thread of shared history and the simple, powerful choice to recognize humanity amid the machinery of war. Neither could know that this moment would mark the beginning of a friendship that would span continents and decades, or that Lieutenant Hargrove would return to Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont many times in the years to come. They could not foresee that the village would eventually erect a small memorial, honoring both Jean-Pierre Bouvier and the American platoon that chose protection over destruction. Such knowledge belonged to a future still obscured by the uncertainties of the ongoing conflict. For now, it was enough that a village still stood, that lives had been preserved, and that even amid the mechanized destruction of modern warfare, individual conscience could still alter the course of events. "Coffee," Marie offered, gesturing toward her kitchen. "Yes," Hargrove replied with a grateful smile. "Coffee would be wonderful." The next 2 weeks in Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont established a rhythm unlike anything Lieutenant Hargrove had experienced since leaving American shores. Each morning began with a security briefing from Sergeant Calloway, followed by patrol rotations and perimeter checks. But unlike their previous combat operations, these military duties now intertwined with the gentle cadence of civilian life that persisted despite the surrounding conflict. Marie Bouvier had become the unofficial liaison between the American soldiers and the French villagers. Her command of English made her invaluable, but it was her natural dignity and wisdom that truly bridged the cultural gap. Under her guidance, the soldiers found themselves drawn into the community they had been tasked with protecting. On the 5th day after the arrival of Major Collins, a convoy of 3 trucks from Civil Affairs Division reached the village. Captain Eleanor Whitman, a brisk, efficient woman in her 30s, introduced herself to Hargrove as the officer in charge of civilian displacement and relocation. "We received somewhat unusual orders regarding this particular settlement, Lieutenant," she remarked, consulting her clipboard. "Normally these forward villages are cleared completely. May I ask what makes Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont an exception?" Hargrove led her to Marie Bouvier's house, where the story of Jean-Pierre's sacrifice in the previous conflict and Major Collins's personal connection explained more eloquently than any official report why this village had been spared. Captain Whitman's professional demeanor softened as she listened to Marie recount her son's story. "I see," she said finally. "Well, this certainly falls under special circumstances." She made several notations on her papers. "Instead of evacuation, we'll establish this as a civilian protection zone. You'll receive regular supply deliveries for both military personnel and civilians." The medical team accompanying Captain Whitman examined the elderly and infirm villagers, paying particular attention to Monsieur Dupont's heart condition. A young medic named Lieutenant Sarah Foster took special interest in Marie's knowledge of traditional remedies. "The foxglove tincture you prepared saved his life," Foster told Marie as they walked through the garden behind the house. Our pharmaceutical digitalis works on the same principle, but in these conditions having a renewable source is invaluable. Marie smiled, pleased by the recognition. My husband always said that modern medicine and traditional knowledge should complement each other, not compete. He would be happy to see an American doctor taking interest in our local plants. I'm taking notes on everything you show me, Foster assured her. This information could help other field medics when supplies run short. By the end of the week, Captain Whitman's team had established a small medical station in what had once been the village schoolhouse. The two children, siblings named Pierre and Isabelle, began spending their mornings there, fascinated by the equipment and eager for attention from the American personnel, who seemed equally delighted by their presence. Throughout these developments, Hargrove found himself returning to Marie Bouvier's home nearly every evening. Sometimes they would sit in comfortable silence, Marie knitting while Hargrove read through Jean-Pierre's journal by lamplight. Other evenings, they would engage in long conversations about history, philosophy, and the uncertain future that awaited when the conflict finally ended. "What will you do when you return to Connecticut, Thomas?" Marie asked one evening, having gradually shifted to using his first name in these private conversations. Hargrove considered the question carefully. "Before the war, I taught history to high school students. I always thought I'd return to that. And now? Now I've lived more history than I ever taught," he admitted. "I'm not sure the classroom will feel the same." Marie nodded in understanding. Henri said similar things after the last war. He was a different man when he returned, more serious, more determined to make each day meaningful. But he still found joy, especially in helping others. She paused her knitting, studying Hargrove's face in the gentle light. "You have that same quality, the ability to see the person behind the circumstance. It's why the men respect you and why you struggled so much with the order to burn our village." Hargrove felt unexpectedly moved by her assessment. In the chaos of combat operations, reflection on one's character was a luxury seldom afforded. "I hope you're right," he said simply. "The teacher understands the power of stories," Marie continued. "When this conflict ends, there will be so many stories needing to be told, not just of battles won and lost, but of moments like this, when humanity prevailed over destruction." The journal of Jean-Pierre Bouvier had become Hargrove's nightly reading. Written in a mixture of French and English, it chronicled the young interpreter's experiences with the American forces in 1918. His initial idealism, the harsh realities of combat, the friendships formed across language and cultural barriers, and finally, his growing conviction that the true enemy was not the German soldiers, but the concept of war itself. "He was only 23, Hargrove remarked one night, closing the journal after reading an entry dated just 2 weeks before Jean-Pierre's death at Château Thierry. "Younger than most of my men." "But he lived fully," Marie replied. "That's what matters, no? Not the number of years, but their quality." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant Calloway, his expression tense. "Sorry to disturb you, sir, but we've got movement on the Eastern Road, multiple vehicles approaching." Hargrove was on his feet immediately. "German?" "Can't confirm, sir. The moon's behind clouds, and they're running without lights." "Wake the men. Defensive positions. No firing without my direct order." Hargrove turned to Marie. "Stay inside, away from windows. If you hear sustained gunfire, take the tunnel." The tunnel was a recent discovery, a narrow passage leading from Marie's root cellar to an exit behind the church, originally built during religious persecutions centuries earlier. Hargrove had designated it as an emergency evacuation route for the civilians. Outside, the village had transformed in seconds from peaceful repose to combat readiness. Soldiers moved with practiced efficiency to predetermined positions, weapons ready but silent. The approaching vehicles, Hargrove could now make out the sound of at least 3 engines, continued their slow advance. "Hold fire," Hargrove whispered into his radio as he positioned himself in the church tower with a clear view of the eastern approach. "Let them come all the way in." Through his binoculars, he could make out the silhouettes of 2 trucks and what appeared to be an armored car. They moved cautiously, clearly aware they might be entering hostile territory. As the lead vehicle reached the edge of the village, a flare suddenly illuminated the night sky, bathing the scene in harsh white light. Hargrove's finger tensed on his trigger, then relaxed as he recognized the distinctive profile of American vehicles. "Stand down," he ordered through the radio. "They're ours." The small convoy rolled into the village square, and from the lead jeep emerged a familiar figure. Major Collins, now accompanied by several officers, Hargrove didn't recognize. "Lieutenant," Collins called out as Hargrove approached and saluted. "Sorry for the dramatic entrance. We've had reports of German patrols in the area intercepting Allied vehicles. No apologies necessary, sir. We maintain full alert status, especially at night." Collins nodded approvingly, then gestured to the officers accompanying him. "Lieutenant Hargrove, this is Colonel William Preston from Division Intelligence and Captain Richard Martinez from Operations Planning." Hargrove exchanged salutes with the senior officers, noting their serious expressions. Whatever had brought this delegation to Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont in the middle of the night was clearly significant. "Let's speak inside," Colonel Preston suggested. "We have matters to discuss that shouldn't be overheard." They settled in the small room that had once served as the village mayor's office, now functioning as Hargrove's headquarters. Maps of the surrounding region covered one wall, marked with known Allied and suspected enemy positions. "I'll come straight to the point, Lieutenant," Colonel Preston began, once the door was closed. "We have intelligence suggesting a German counter-offensive is being planned, small but potentially disruptive to our supply lines. They're apparently consolidating forces approximately 15 kilometers northeast of here." Hargrove studied the map where Preston had indicated. "That's the Argonne forest edge. Difficult terrain, good cover." "Precisely," Captain Martinez confirmed. "And our intelligence suggests they're using a network of local informants to coordinate their movements and avoid our patrols." The implication hung in the air for a moment before Hargrove addressed it directly. "Sir, are you suggesting there might be German sympathizers in this village?" Major Collins shook his head. "Not necessarily in this village specifically, Lieutenant, but in this region certainly. The proximity of the German border meant this area had significant cultural and economic ties before the war. Family connections, business relationships, these don't simply disappear when conflict begins." Colonel Preston leaned forward. "What we need, Lieutenant, is information. You and your men have been here for over 2 weeks now. You've established rapport with the locals. They trust you. You want us to question them," Hargrove concluded, not entirely comfortable with the direction this conversation was taking. "Not interrogate," Major Collins clarified quickly. "Simply observe. Listen. These people talk to you now. They might mention things. Unusual visitors in neighboring villages, strangers asking questions, patterns of movement in the forest." Captain Martinez added, "The locals know this terrain better than any map. They know when something is out of place. That kind of intelligence is invaluable." Hargrove nodded slowly. The request seemed reasonable enough, though he remained wary of anything that might damage the trust his unit had built with the villagers of Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont. "There's another aspect to this, Lieutenant," Colonel Preston continued. "We believe the Germans may attempt to retake certain villages in this sector as observation posts for directing artillery against our supply convoys. Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont, with its elevated church tower and clear sightlines to the main road, would be particularly valuable." "You're saying we could become a target?" Hargrove concluded. "It's a possibility we need to prepare for," Major Collins confirmed. "Which brings us to the second reason for our visit. We're reinforcing your position." Captain Martinez outlined the details. "You'll receive an additional platoon tomorrow, along with a machine gun section and a radio team. We're designating Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont as a forward defense point rather than just a civilian protection zone." The implications were clear. The village that Hargrove had saved from destruction might now become a battleground. "What about the civilian?" he asked. Colonel Preston's expression remained neutral. "Ideally, they should be evacuated now that we have reason to believe this area may see active combat. However," he glanced at Major Collins, who nodded slightly, "given the special circumstances of this particular village, we're leaving that decision to your discretion, Lieutenant. If you believe the civilians can be safely sheltered here, during a potential engagement. We'll support that assessment. Hargrove felt the weight of responsibility settle more heavily on his shoulders. He thought of Marie Bouvier's stubborn refusal to leave her home, of Monsieur Dupont's fragile heart condition, of the young siblings Pierre and Isabelle, who had already lost so much. "Thank you, sir. I'll discuss the situation with the villagers, but I suspect most will choose to remain. We've identified several secure shelter locations, including a network of old cellars and tunnels." The meeting concluded with specific instructions for defensive preparations and intelligence gathering. As the officers prepared to depart, Major Collins took Hargrove aside. "How is Madame Bouvier?" he asked. "Remarkable," Hargrove replied honestly. "She's become the heart of our operation here. The men respect her enormously." Collins smiled. "My father would have expected nothing less from the mother of Jean Bouvier." His expression grew more serious. "Look after her, Lieutenant. If the situation deteriorates rapidly, get her out, even if she protests. Some debts transcend generations." After the officers departed, Hargrove found himself unable to sleep. The pre-dawn hours found him in the church tower, scanning the darkened landscape beyond the village. The distant forest where German forces were allegedly gathering appeared as nothing more than a deeper shadow against the night sky. "You should rest," came Marie's voice from behind him, startling him from his contemplation. "I didn't hear you climb the stairs," Hargrove said, turning to find her wrapped in a shawl against the night chill. "These old stones have heard my footsteps for 7 decades, she replied with a slight smile. "We understand each other." Hargrove made room for her on the narrow bench. "You shouldn't be up here, it's not safe. Neither should you, yet here we both are." She studied his face in the dim light. "Something has changed. Those officers brought troubling news." There seemed little point in concealment. Marie had proven herself repeatedly as someone who valued truth, however difficult. Hargrove outlined the intelligence about potential German movements and the decision to reinforce the village. Marie listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful rather than fearful. When he finished, she nodded as if confirming something she had already suspected. "History circles back upon itself," she observed. "In 1914, this village was briefly caught between advancing German forces and retreating French positions. We survived then. We will survive now." "The circumstances are different," Hargrove cautioned. "Modern warfare is more destructive. If you were to evacuate, to become a refugee at 73, Marie shook her head firmly. "No, Lieutenant. My place is here, but I will help prepare the others, especially the children. They should have the choice." The conversation shifted to practical matters, which cellars offered the best protection, how to store adequate supplies, signals to indicate when civilians should take shelter. Throughout the discussion, Hargrove was struck by Marie's clarity of thought and absence of panic. "You've considered these possibilities already," he realized. "Of course," she acknowledged. "I've lived through one great conflict. I observed how the village mayor failed to prepare adequately, how families suffered because they could not imagine the worst. I promised myself I would not repeat those mistakes if war came again." As dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, they descended from the tower. The village was stirring, soldiers changing watch, early rising villagers tending to morning chores. On the surface it appeared peaceful, but Hargrove could sense a new tension, an alertness that hadn't been present before. The promised reinforcements arrived by mid-morning. 38 additional soldiers led by Lieutenant Paul Davidson, a serious young officer from Minnesota. The machine gun section immediately began identifying optimal fields of fire, while the radio team established communications with nearby Allied units. Throughout the day, Hargrove oversaw the integration of the new forces, ensuring that the defensive preparations remained as unobtrusive as possible to avoid alarming the civilians. Marie, true to her word, spoke quietly with each village family, preparing them for the possibility of conflict without inducing panic. By evening, Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont had been subtly transformed. Sandbagged positions reinforced key buildings, ammunition caches were distributed strategically throughout the village, and observation posts maintained constant vigilance on all approaches. To an untrained eye, little might appear different, but the village had effectively become a fortress. As darkness fell, Hargrove gathered both platoons for a briefing in what had once been the village square. "Our mission has two equal priorities," he emphasized. "Defend this position against potential enemy action and ensure the safety of the civilian population that has chosen to remain. These people trust us with their lives and homes. We will not betray that trust." Lieutenant Davidson nodded in agreement. "My men understand, sir. We've been briefed on the special status of this village. For the next 3 days, the reinforced company maintained heightened vigilance while attempting to gather intelligence from the surrounding area. Patrols ventured farther into the countryside, making contact with other Allied units and local farmers. The villagers, initially wary of the increased military presence, gradually adapted to the new reality. Marie Bouvier emerged as an unexpected asset in the intelligence-gathering effort. Her connections with other villages in the region, family ties, old friendships, trading relationships, provided insights that formal military channels could not access. Through her network, Hargrove began receiving reports of unusual movements in the forest, unfamiliar faces appearing in markets, and strange signals observed at night. Claude Renaud from Saint-Menehould says his cousin noticed German supply trucks moving at night along the old logging road, Marie reported one afternoon, referring to her notes. Not a full convoy, 3 or 4 vehicles traveling without lights. Hargrove marked the location on his map. "That's consistent with reports from our eastern patrols. They're definitely building something up there." "There is more," Marie continued. "The baker in Givry-en-Argonne overheard customers speaking with unusual accents. They purchased large quantities of bread and disappeared toward the forest. Each fragment of information, insignificant on its own, contributed to a growing picture of German forces establishing a presence approximately 12 kilometers northeast of Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont. Hargrove dutifully relayed these findings to Division Intelligence, which confirmed their alignment with other sources. On the morning of the 4th day after the reinforcements arrived, Private Patterson returned from perimeter patrol with a French farmer in tow, a thin, weathered man named Marcel Fournier, whose property lay at the edge of the Argonne forest. "He came running toward our position, sir," Patterson reported. "Says he has urgent information." With Marie translating, the farmer described seeing a column of German vehicles, including what he believed were 2 light tanks, moving through the forest near his farm shortly before dawn. "They were heading southwest," Marie translated, her expression grave, "directly toward our position." Hargrove immediately ordered the village to full alert status. Civilians were directed to the designated shelter areas. Defensive positions were fully manned, and urgent messages were dispatched to neighboring Allied units requesting support. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere in Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont had transformed completely. The casual integration of military and civilian life had been replaced by the tense efficiency of a position preparing for imminent attack. Sergeant Calloway oversaw the final distribution of ammunition, while Lieutenant Davidson's men fortified the approaches to the village with obstacles and improvised mines. Marie Bouvier refused to take shelter, instead assisting with final preparations for the other villagers. She helped Monsieur Dupont settle in the reinforced cellar beneath the church, ensuring he had adequate medication. She comforted the young siblings Pierre and Isabelle, transforming their fear into a sense of adventure by describing the cellar as a secret castle where they would be safe. "You should join them now," Hargrove told her as the sun began to set. "Intelligence suggests the Germans prefer night attacks when they're outnumbered." Marie shook her head. "Not yet. There are still things to be done." "Marie," Hargrove said firmly, using her first name deliberately, "this isn't 1918. Modern warfare is—" "I know precisely what modern warfare is, Lieutenant," she interrupted, her tone uncharacteristically sharp. "I have seen the refugees streaming through our region for 5 years. I have heard the bombers overhead. I am not remaining out of ignorance or stubbornness, but because I can still be useful." Before Hargrove could respond, the radio operator called for him urgently. "Lieutenant, message from command." The transmission was brief, but significant. Allied reconnaissance aircraft had observed enemy movement consistent with Marcel Fournier's report. However, the German force appeared to be splitting, with the main column continuing southwest toward the larger town of Vitry-le-François, and only a smaller contingent, perhaps a reconnaissance element, moving in the direction of Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont. They're after the supply depot at Vitry, Hargrove realized. We're likely just a secondary objective, an observation post for their artillery. Or they may bypass us entirely if they don't realize our strength, Lieutenant Davidson suggested. Hargrove considered the possibilities. We maintain full alert. If they approach, we let their advance elements enter the village before engaging. That way, we might capture prisoners with intelligence about their larger operation. As darkness fell completely, the village of Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont became eerily silent. Soldiers at their posts communicated only in whispers, if at all. The civilians in their shelters maintained similar discipline, understanding that sound carried in the night air. In the church tower, Hargrove maintained personal observation of the eastern approach, where intelligence suggested the German force would most likely appear. Marie Bouvier, despite his repeated requests for her to seek shelter, remained beside him. You once told me that Henri, your husband, treated soldiers from both sides during the First World War, Hargrove said quietly, as they watched the darkened landscape. Yes, Marie confirmed. He believed suffering transcended nationality. If we take German prisoners tonight, they may be wounded. Would you assist our medics in treating them? Marie studied his face in the dim light. You are not what I expected when American soldiers entered our village, Lieutenant Hargrove. What did you expect? Someone less troubled by the contradictions of his position. Someone who would follow orders without question. She paused. Someone who would have burned our village without hesitation. The honesty of her assessment made Hargrove uncomfortable, yet he couldn't deny its accuracy. I've seen enough destruction, he admitted. Sometimes I wonder what we're preserving by creating more of it. Their conversation was interrupted by a barely perceptible movement on the road leading from the forest. A deeper shadow against the darkness, moving slowly but deliberately toward the village. Contact, Hargrove whispered into his radio. Eastern approach, unknown number, hold positions. Through his binoculars, he could now make out what appeared to be a small convoy, 2 armored vehicles, followed by what might be a truck. They moved without lights, engines muffled, clearly attempting to approach undetected. They don't know we're waiting, Hargrove realized. They think this is still an undefended village. The plan had been to allow the German forces to enter the village before engaging, potentially trapping them in the narrow streets. But as Hargrove tracked their approach, he noted that one of the armored vehicles carried what appeared to be a larger gun, possibly an anti-tank or artillery piece that could cause devastating damage to the village structures if fired at close range. He made a rapid tactical adjustment. Sergeant Calloway, light them up when they reach the orchard boundary. Davidson, be ready to hit their flank if they try to retreat to the forest. Marie touched his arm. Thomas, if you engage them at that distance, the children in the church cellar will be directly behind their position if they return fire. Hargrove felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. She was right. The line of fire would place the church directly in danger. But allowing the Germans to advance further would put them in position to potentially cause even greater damage throughout the village. In that moment of indecision, fate intervened. One of the German vehicles, perhaps detecting something amiss or simply navigating poorly in the darkness, veered slightly off the road and struck what sounded like a fallen tree branch. The crack echoed in the night silence, causing the convoy to halt abruptly. For several tense seconds, nothing moved. Then, unexpectedly, the lead vehicle's hatch opened and a figure emerged, presumably an officer surveying the situation. "Hold fire," Hargrove ordered into his radio, watching intently as the German officer appeared to be consulting a map by the dim light of a shielded flashlight. Beside him, Marie Bouvier had gone very still. "That road," she whispered. "The branch that fell across it, that was during the storm 3 days ago. I told the children not to clear it because the birds had built a nest in it." The simple, human detail, children preserving a bird's nest, Germans halting to consult a map, created a surreal moment of normalcy amid the deadly tension of the situation. But the reality of conflict quickly reasserted itself as the German officer apparently made a decision. He issued what must have been orders to the other vehicles, which began turning around in a clear indication that they were abandoning the approach to Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont. The German force had decided the village wasn't worth the potential risk. Hargrove watched with a mixture of relief and disbelief as the small convoy retreated toward the forest. Within minutes, they had disappeared into the darkness from which they had emerged. "Stand down to condition yellow," Hargrove ordered through his radio. "Maintain observation. They may return." As the tension of imminent combat dissipated, he found himself seated on the narrow bench of the church tower, suddenly exhausted. Marie Bouvier sat beside him, her expression thoughtful. "A fallen branch and a bird's nest," she mused. "Such small things to change the course of events." "They may return with reinforcements," Hargrove cautioned. "Perhaps," Marie acknowledged. "But tonight, at least there was no battle for Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont." The German reconnaissance element did not return. By morning, reports from Allied aircraft confirmed that the main German force had been engaged by American units near Vitry-le-François and was in retreat. The anticipated counter-offensive had materialized as little more than a probing action, possibly an effort to gauge Allied strength in the region before a larger operation. For the next several days, Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont remained on heightened alert, but the immediate threat had passed. The civilians emerged from their shelters and gradually resumed their daily activities, now interspersed with the continued military presence. A week after the aborted German approach, orders arrived reassigning most of the reinforcements to positions farther east. Lieutenant Davidson's platoon departed with heartfelt farewells to the villagers who had briefly become their hosts. The machine gun section and radio team remained, integrating with Hargrove's original unit. The village settled into a new normal. Neither the purely civilian community it had been before the conflict, nor the purely military installation it might have become. Instead, Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont existed as something unique, a place where soldiers and civilians had found common purpose in preservation rather than destruction. As April gave way to May, news reached them of dramatic developments elsewhere: the linkage of American and Soviet forces at the Elbe River, the fall of Berlin, and finally, on May 8th, the unconditional surrender of German forces in Europe. The end of hostilities in Europe brought both joy and uncertainty to Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont. The immediate threat had passed, but questions about the future loomed large. Would the American forces depart immediately? Would the displaced persons from other villages return to their homes? What would happen to the relationships formed during these extraordinary months? For Lieutenant Thomas Hargrove, the end of the conflict in Europe brought specific orders. His unit would remain in Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont for an additional 30 days to assist with regional stabilization before being reassigned, possibly to the Pacific Theater, where fighting continued against Japan. On a warm evening in late May, Hargrove sat with Marie Bouvier in her garden, which was now flourishing with spring growth. The foxglove that had saved Monsieur Dupont's life was in bloom, its purple flowers nodding in the gentle breeze. "I received a letter from Major Collins," Hargrove told her. "He's been promoted to lieutenant colonel. He asked specifically about you." Marie smiled. "Please convey my congratulations and good wishes when you respond. He also mentioned that he's recommended Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont for special designation in the reconstruction program. Your village will receive priority for rebuilding supplies and assistance." "Our village," Marie corrected gently. "After all that has happened, I think you have earned the right to consider it partly yours as well." The thought warmed Hargrove unexpectedly. In all his months in Europe, this small community was the only place that had begun to feel something like home. "I've been thinking about what comes next," he admitted. "After my service ends, I'm not sure teaching history in Connecticut is enough anymore." "What would be enough?" Marie asked. Hargrove gestured to the village around them. "This, making a difference directly, not just teaching about the past but helping build a better future." Marie nodded in understanding. Henri felt the same after the last conflict. That's why he expanded his medical practice to serve the surrounding villages, not just our own. He said healing was his way of countering what the war had destroyed. "I've been corresponding with Captain Whitman from Civil Affairs," Hargrove continued. "There will be positions in the reconstruction efforts, helping communities rebuild, mediating between military necessity and civilian needs. She thinks my experience here would be valuable." "She is right," Marie affirmed. You have a gift for seeing people as individuals, not abstractions. That is what reconstruction will require most. The ability to remember that each broken building represents a broken home, each damaged community a collection of disrupted lives. They sat in companionable silence as the sun began to set, painting the stone houses of Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont in warm golden light. In the village square, several of Hargrove's men were playing baseball with the local children, their laughter carrying on the evening air. "I will miss this when you go," Marie said finally. "The village will seem very quiet." "I've been authorized to leave a small detachment here through the summer," Hargrove told her, "and I've made arrangements for regular supply deliveries to continue." Marie shook her head, smiling. "Always so practical, Lieutenant. But it is not supplies or protection I will miss most. It is the conversations, the perspective you bring, the way you have become part of our community's story." The simple statement affected Hargrove deeply. Throughout his military service, he had focused on objectives, strategies, the mechanics of warfare. Rarely had he considered how he might be incorporated into the narrative of the communities through which he passed. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said after a moment. "Jean-Pierre's journal. You gave it to me that first night. Why?" Marie considered the question thoughtfully. "Because I recognized something in you that reminded me of him. A questioning mind, a sense of responsibility beyond mere duty. I thought his words might help you navigate your own journey through this conflict." "They have," Hargrove acknowledged, "more than you know." The journal had become a touchstone for him, a reminder that the tensions he felt between orders and conscience, between military necessity and human dignity, were not unique to this conflict. Jean-Pierre Bouvier had walked a similar path 27 years earlier, asking similar questions, seeking similar balance. "I would like you to keep it," Marie said, as if reading his thoughts. "Jean-Pierre's words have found their purpose with you." "Thank you," Hargrove replied, genuinely moved by the gesture. "I'll treasure it always." As darkness fell over the village, they moved inside where Marie prepared a simple meal. The ritual had become familiar over the weeks, the lighting of lamps, the setting of places at the wooden table, the sharing of bread and conversation. What had begun as an emergency military occupation had transformed into something approaching family. "When you return to America," Marie said as they finished their meal, "what will you tell people about Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont?" Hargrove considered the question carefully. "I'll tell them about a village that was saved by history, by connections that spanned generations and reminded us of our shared humanity in the midst of conflict. I'll tell them about the woman who refused to abandon her home, and in doing so, preserved not just buildings, but something much more valuable, a community, a continuity of life that transcended the destruction around it." Marie smiled, pleased with his answer. "And I will tell future generations of this village about the American lieutenant who was ordered to burn our homes but chose protection instead. I will tell them that sometimes, even in war, there are moments when conscience prevails over convenience, when preservation defeats destruction." In the years that followed, both kept their promises. Lieutenant Thomas Hargrove did return to America after the war ended, but not to his classroom in Connecticut. Instead, he joined the international reconstruction efforts in Europe, eventually working for agencies that would evolve into lasting institutions of international cooperation. Every year, he would return to Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont to visit Marie Bouvier, bringing books for the village school and medical supplies for the clinic that had grown from the temporary station established during the conflict. Their friendship deepened over decades, bridging the Atlantic just as it had once bridged the divide between military and civilian worlds. Marie lived to the remarkable age of 96, becoming a beloved village elder who shared her memories with multiple generations. The story of how Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont was spared destruction became part of the community's identity, a testament to the power of individual choice in the face of seemingly inevitable destruction. When Marie Bouvier was finally laid to rest beside her husband in the garden behind her house, Thomas Hargrove, by then a distinguished diplomat in his 70s, stood among the mourners, Jean-Pierre's journal still in his possession after all those years. The village that had almost been reduced to ash in 1945 had instead flourished, becoming known throughout the region for its annual celebration of Franco-American friendship. The small house that had stopped a lieutenant from following orders of destruction had become a museum dedicated to civilian-military cooperation during times of conflict, and on the village square, a modest memorial stone bore the names of 3 individuals separated by time but united by purpose. Jean-Pierre Bouvier, the interpreter who died saving American lives in the First World War; Major James Collins, the officer who wrote of his bravery; and Lieutenant Thomas Hargrove, who recognized humanity amid the machinery of war and chose preservation over destruction. Perhaps most remarkable of all, the decision made in those fateful days of April 1945 to protect rather than destroy had ripple effects far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. The medical station established in Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont became a permanent facility after the war, eventually growing into a regional medical center that saved countless lives. The documentation of Marie Bouvier's traditional remedies, begun by Lieutenant Foster during her brief assignment to the village, led to several important pharmacological discoveries in the post-war years. The children of the village, particularly Pierre and Isabelle, grew up with a unique perspective on international cooperation, inspired by their experiences during those transformative months. Pierre would eventually become a diplomat himself, directly crediting his interactions with Lieutenant Hargrove and his men for his career choice. Isabelle established an international student exchange program that brought young Americans to Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont each summer, continuing the connection between the village and the nation that had preserved it. In his final visit to the village before his own passing, Thomas Hargrove, by then in his 80s, sat in the garden where he had shared so many conversations with Marie Bouvier. The foxglove still bloomed there, descendants of the plants that had saved Monsieur Dupont's life all those years ago. The stone houses still stood solid against the horizon, preserved by a decision made in a moment of moral clarity amid the fog of war. In the distance, he could hear the laughter of children playing in the village square. French and American voices mingled in the universal language of play. The sound brought a smile to his aged face, a confirmation that some choices echo far beyond their moment, creating harmonies that transcend the discordant clashes of conflict. The village of Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont had been scheduled for destruction in the name of military necessity. Instead, it had become a living testament to the power of recognition of shared humanity, of historical connection, of the simple truth that preservation often serves greater strategic purposes than destruction. As Thomas Hargrove departed the village for the final time, he left Jean-Pierre's journal in the small museum that had once been Marie Bouvier's home. The circle that began with a French interpreter saving American lives in 1918 continued with an American lieutenant saving a French village in 1945, was now complete. A story not of conflict but of connection across time and circumstance. The lesson of Saint-Rémy-en-Bouzemont remained clear for future generations. In the calculus of conflict, the human dimension must never be forgotten. For it is not in the buildings preserved or destroyed that history finds its meaning, but in the lives touched, the connections forged, and the moments when individuals choose conscience over convenience, preservation over destruction, humanity over expediency. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.